9 interruptions. That was how many times J.D. Vance would cut off Jasmine Crockett before she finished dismantling him on live television. By the time the broadcast ended, the vice president-elect would be unable to speak, his microphone would be ripped off, and one phrase would haunt him forever. "I read your book." What made him say those words? "You're going to want to hear this." The Newsmax studio was built for combat. 2 chairs under harsh lighting. No moderator. No commercial breaks. 75 uninterrupted minutes billed as a conversation between the new administration and its critics. Vance arrived 12 minutes early, his staff arranging binders, his makeup artist making adjustments. He had done this before. Best-selling author, venture capitalist, senator, vice president-elect. This was his environment. Jasmine Crockett was already seated. She did not stand to greet him. Navy suit, single American flag pin, hands folded on a manila folder. No binder, no notes visible. Vance registered her stillness but misread it. He extended his hand. She shook it once and returned to position, eyes on the folder. The cameras went live. The host's brief introduction lasted 45 seconds. Then he disappeared, leaving them alone. Vance smiled the smile that had carried him through 100 interviews. Confident, dismissive in its warmth. "Congresswoman," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I appreciate you coming on. I know it must be difficult for someone with your limited experience in government to understand the scope of what we're trying to accomplish here, but I'll do my best to explain it in terms that make sense to you." The insult was wrapped in courtesy, which made it sharper. "Limited experience. Someone like you." The condescension was in every syllable. Crockett's face did not change. She opened the folder with the care of someone handling ancient manuscripts. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of 9 items. She set it on the table between them where the camera could see it. Each item was a single word written in black marker. The words were visible to Vance if he leaned forward. He did not lean forward. "Vice President-elect," she said, her voice carrying the temperature of a December morning, "you've written extensively about the failures of our political class. You've talked about how elites abandoned working families. You've called yourself a voice for the forgotten. That's the brand you've built, and I respect the marketing, but we're not here for marketing today. We're here for math." Vance's smile tightened. She had not responded to his dismissal. She had not defended her credentials. She had simply started. This was the first indication that the script he had prepared would not be followed. "Let's talk about something you know well," she continued, glancing at the paper but not reading from it. "Venture capital. You spent years at a firm that invested in companies. You made those decisions based on data, on outcomes, on whether the numbers added up. That's your world. So I'm going to show you numbers, and you're going to tell me if they add up." She paused. 3 seconds. 5. The silence was not hostile. It was surgical. It created space for what came next. "In your book, Hillbilly Elegy, you wrote about your grandmother saving you from a life of poverty and addiction. You credited her discipline, her refusal to accept excuses, her insistence on accountability. It's a powerful story. I'm not questioning the story. I'm questioning what you did with it." Vance interrupted. "Congresswoman, if you're going to psychoanalyze my family—" "I'm not analyzing your family," she said without raising her volume. "I'm analyzing your record." She reached down and lifted a second folder, thicker. Color-coded tabs marked different sections. She opened to a yellow tab and turned it so the camera could see a printed chart. Columns, dates, dollar amounts. "This is your voting record on the expanded child tax credit. In 2021, that credit lifted 9 million children out of poverty. That's not my number. That's the Census Bureau. Your grandmother raised you on Social Security survivor benefits after your grandfather died. Those benefits kept you housed, fed, and in school. You've said that publicly. You've written about it. But when the expanded child tax credit came up for renewal in 2022, you voted no. Not once. 3 times. You blocked it in committee. You filibustered it on the floor. You called it socialism for the lazy." Vance leaned forward. "That credit was—" "You're going to want to let me finish," Crockett said, and the steel in her voice made him stop. "Because we're not talking about one vote. We're talking about a pattern." She turned to the next tab, read this time, another chart, more dates, more dollar amounts. December 2022, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This bill required employers to provide reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers, a stool to sit on, bathroom breaks, lighter duty assignments, basic human dignity. The bill had bipartisan support. It passed the House 315 to 101. Your grandmother worked at a factory while pregnant with your mother. You wrote about how she had to hide her pregnancy to keep her job, how she stood for 10-hour shifts even when her ankles swelled so badly she could barely walk home. That's in your book. Chapter 4. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither blinked. When the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act came to the Senate, you voted no. You called it government overreach. You said employers should be trusted to do the right thing without mandates. But your own grandmother's employer didn't do the right thing, did they? They made her stand for 10 hours while pregnant. They would have fired her if they'd known. You wrote about that injustice, and then you voted to preserve it. Vance's hands gripped the armrests. You're taking those votes out of context. Am I? She did not wait for him to answer. She turned to the next tab, green. March 2023, the SNAP Benefits Protection Act. This bill prevented states from implementing work requirements that would have cut food assistance to 750,000 people, including 240,000 children. You grew up on food stamps. You've talked about the shame of using them at the grocery store, the looks from other customers, the way your grandmother would snap at the cashier if they took too long processing the card. You turned that shame into a story about resilience. And then you voted to take food stamps away from families just like yours. Those families need to work, Vance started, his voice rising. Crockett spoke over him, not louder, just through him. Your grandmother was working. She worked full-time at the factory and still needed food stamps because the factory paid poverty wages. Work requirements don't help people who are already working and still can't afford food. They just starve them faster. She turned another page, another chart, another pattern. April 2023, the Affordable Insulin Act. Capped insulin costs at $35 per month. Your mother is diabetic. You wrote about her rationing insulin because she couldn't afford it. You wrote about driving her to Canada to buy it cheaper, about her choosing between insulin and rent. When this bill came to the Senate, you abstained. You didn't even vote no, you just didn't show up. Vance's face was changing color. I had a scheduling conflict. You were in Ohio giving a speech about how Democrats don't care about working families. The vote was at 2 p.m. You spoke at 11 a.m. in Cleveland, 90-minute flight. You could have made it, you chose not to. She turned to the next section. The tabs were blue now, multiple pages. May 2023, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Expansion. This bill simplified the process for teachers, nurses, and social workers to get their student loans forgiven after 10 years of public service. Your law school debt was $210,000. You've talked about how you paid it off with your first year's salary at the venture capital firm, how that gave you freedom, how debt holds people back from building wealth. But when teachers making $40,000 a year asked for the same freedom, you called them entitled. You said they made their choices and should live with them. They did make their choices, Vance said, and this time his voice cracked slightly. Nobody forced them to take those loans. Nobody forced you either, Crockett replied, but you had options they don't. You had venture capital money. They have second jobs driving for Uber. You wrote about how debt is a trap. Then you voted to keep people trapped. 9 interruptions. That was the count at this point in the broadcast. Every time Crockett presented evidence, Vance tried to deflect, tried to pivot, tried to reframe, and every time she brought him back to the numbers, back to his own book, back to his own family's story, back to the distance between what he claimed to believe and what he actually voted for. The folder was not yet finished. Crockett turned to the final section. The tabs were black. June 2024, the Veteran Housing Protection Act. This bill prevented corporate landlords from evicting disabled veterans who fell behind on rent due to delayed VA payments. Your grandfather was a Korean War veteran. He came home with shrapnel in his spine and PTSD they didn't have a name for yet. The VA lost his disability claim 3 times. 3 times your grandmother had to fight to get his benefits reinstated while he couldn't work and the rent went unpaid. You wrote about the landlord threatening eviction, about your grandmother standing in the office refusing to leave until they gave her more time. You wrote about how close your family came to being homeless because of bureaucratic delays outside your grandfather's control. She looked at him. 10 seconds. 15. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. When disabled veterans asked for that same grace period, you voted no. You said landlords shouldn't have to carry the cost of government failures, but your grandmother's landlord did carry that cost. That's the only reason you had a home to grow up in, and you voted to take that protection away. Vance stood up. He didn't walk anywhere. He just stood there, his hand on the back of the chair, staring at the folder still open on the table. Crockett was not done. Vice President-elect, you wrote a book about how America abandoned its working class. You wrote about communities destroyed by factory closures, families broken by addiction, children raised by grandparents because the parents couldn't function. You wrote about all of it. And then you got elected on that story. You became the voice of the forgotten, the working class hero, the guy who escaped and came back to help. She closed the folder. The sound was louder than it should have been. But you didn't come back to help. You came back to make sure nobody else could escape. The silence that followed was absolute. Vance's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The room, the cameras, the production staff behind the glass. Everything stopped. 5 seconds, 10, 15, 20. Someone in the control room coughed, and the sound was jarring in the stillness. Crockett reached beside her chair and lifted a third item. Not a folder this time. A book. Hillbilly Elegy. The original hardcover edition. She held it up for the camera. There were post-it notes marking dozens of pages, highlighted passages visible through the thin paper. I read your book, she said. I read it twice. The first time, I read it like everyone else did. I read it as a story about resilience and family and overcoming impossible odds. The second time, I read it with your voting record next to me. And that's when I understood something. The story isn't the problem. The story is true. Your grandmother did save you. Social Security did keep you housed. Food stamps did keep you fed. Medicaid covered your mother's rehab. Public school educated you. Pell Grants paid for college. All of it. Every safety net you now vote to dismantle is a safety net you personally used to survive. She set the book on the table between them, next to the folder, the physical evidence of his own words. So, my question is simple. Did those programs work for you? Vance sat back down. His hands were shaking, barely visible, but the camera caught it. Yes, he said quietly. Say it louder, Crockett said. The people watching need to hear you. Yes, those programs worked for me. And you vote against them now because... The silence returned. Longer this time. 23 seconds of absolute quiet. Vance looked at his staff through the glass. They had no answer to give him. He looked at the folder, at the book, at Crockett, who had not moved, had not raised her voice, had not shown anger. She was simply sitting there waiting with the patience of someone who had all night if necessary. I don't know, he finally said, and his voice was barely audible. But Crockett heard it. So did 42 million people watching live. You don't know, she repeated, not as a question, as a statement, as the end of his defense. I think, Vance started, then stopped. I think the programs created dependency. I think people use them as a crutch instead of, your grandmother used them as a crutch. Crockett cut him off. Your mother used them as a crutch. You use them as a crutch. Are you calling your family dependent? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Because from where I'm sitting, with your voting record and your family's story both in front of me, the only conclusion I can draw is that you believe safety nets should exist for you, but not for anyone else. You got yours, so pull up the ladder. Is that it? Vance's hand went to his microphone. His fingers found the clip. He started to pull it off. Don't, Crockett said. Not a command, a suggestion. Don't run from this. Your grandmother didn't run from the landlord's office. She stood there until she got what her family needed. You can stand here until you answer the question. His hand stayed on the microphone, frozen. 30 seconds passed. 40. The control room didn't cut to commercial because there were no commercials. This was live, unedited, uninterrupted, and falling apart in real time. Then something shifted in Vance's face. The color drained completely. He looked not angry, but something colder, something more like comprehension that he had entered a room with no exit. Every answer he could give would be used against him. Admit the programs worked and he was a hypocrite for voting against them. Deny the programs worked and he was calling his own family's survival story a lie. There was no third option. Crockett saw the shift. She had been waiting for it. "Let me tell you what I think happened," she said, her voice gentler now but no less precise. "I think you told yourself a story. I think you convinced yourself that your family was different, that your grandmother's work ethic made the difference, that you succeeded because of personal virtue and not because of structural support. I think you needed to believe that because the alternative, that you got lucky, that the safety net caught you when millions of others fell through the gaps, would mean you don't deserve what you have, and that's an uncomfortable truth." She leaned forward. "But the safety net did catch you, and it only caught you because it existed. Your grandmother's work ethic didn't create Social Security. Her determination didn't make food stamps appear. Your mother's resilience didn't write the Medicaid expansion. Those things existed because previous generations fought for them, voted for them, funded them with tax dollars, and protected them from people who wanted to cut them, and now you're the person who wants to cut them." Vance's microphone came off. He stood again, this time backing away from the chair. He looked at his staff through the glass and made a cutting motion across his throat, the universal signal to end the broadcast. But the broadcast didn't end, because Newsmax wasn't his network. He was a guest, and Crockett was still talking. "You can leave if you want," she said. "But the cameras are still on, and 42 million people just watched you run from a simple question. They watched you compare safety net recipients to lazy dependents while sitting in a chair you wouldn't be qualified to sit in without those same programs. They watched you call your own family's survival a moral failure. You did that, not me." He walked off camera. The director didn't follow him. The shot stayed on Crockett, still seated, the folder still open, the book still on the table. She looked directly at the camera. "The vice president-elect wanted to have a conversation about elites abandoning working families. We just did. We talked about a man who used every program designed to help working families escape poverty, and who now votes to make sure working families can't use those same programs. We talked about a man who wrote a best-selling book about the dignity of struggle and then turned that struggle into a campaign prop while voting to make the struggle permanent for everyone else." She closed the folder again, picked up the book, held it for the camera one more time. "This book is about resilience, but resilience isn't enough. If Social Security hadn't existed, J.D. Vance's resilience would have happened in a homeless shelter. If food stamps hadn't existed, his work ethic would have happened on an empty stomach. If Pell Grants hadn't existed, his intelligence would have happened without a college degree. Resilience is what you do with the support you receive. It's not a substitute for that support." She set the book down very gently. "I grew up poor too, black and poor in Texas. Poverty destroys families the same everywhere. I used the same programs J.D. Vance used. Food stamps when my mother couldn't afford groceries, Medicaid when I got sick, subsidized housing when we faced eviction, Pell Grants for college, all of it." Her voice carried no shame, no apology. "And I'm not voting to take those programs away from the next kid who needs them, because I understand something J.D. Vance doesn't. The ladder wasn't built for me. It was built for all of us. And when you climb it and then kick it down behind you, you're not strong. You're just cruel." The camera held on her face. She was not smiling. She was not angry. She looked exhausted in the way someone looks after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being allowed to set it down. At the beginning of this broadcast, the vice president-elect said I had limited experience in government. He said he would explain things in terms I could understand. But I understand just fine. I understand that he built a political career on a story about how government failed his family when the truth is government programs saved his family. I understand that he votes against the same programs that made his success possible because his donors profit when those programs disappear. I understand that he calls himself a voice for the forgotten while voting to make sure the forgotten stay forgotten. She looked into the lens. I understand all of it. What I don't understand is how he sleeps at night. Backstage, J.D. Vance was standing alone in the hallway with his jacket off and his microphone on the floor where he'd thrown it. His staff surrounded him, but nobody was talking. On the monitor mounted to the wall, Crockett was still speaking, still seated, still calm. The broadcast would run another 11 minutes with her alone in the chair, answering viewer call-in questions, explaining the policy details behind each vote she'd referenced, providing the documentation for every claim. She would not gloat. She would not celebrate. She would simply continue the work. The next morning, every major network would replay the 23 seconds of silence. The moment when a man who had written a book about resilience, who had campaigned as a champion of the forgotten, who had just been elected Vice President of the United States, could not answer a simple question. If the programs worked for you, why are you voting to destroy them? There was no good answer. There never had been. Crockett had known that before she walked into the studio. She had built the entire confrontation around that knowledge. Every folder, every vote, every quote from his own book, all of it leading to a question with no exit. In the days that followed, Vance's team would try to reframe the encounter. They would say he was ambushed, that Crockett took his votes out of context, that the media was biased. None of it landed. She hadn't used opinions. She had used his own words and his own voting record. There was nothing to spin. The book stayed on newsstands. The voting record stayed public. The contradiction stayed unresolved. If the safety net worked for you, why shouldn't it work for anyone else? The question had no answer. It never had. That's what made the 23 seconds of silence so devastating. Not Crockett's words, his inability to defend against them. Jasmine Crockett returned to Congress the following week and introduced the Family Security Act, a bill expanding every program Vance had voted against. The bill was named after his grandmother, not as insult, as tribute, because his grandmother had deserved those programs, and so did everyone else. The bill didn't pass, not that session. But the floor debate lasted 9 hours. 9, like the number of interruptions before Crockett systematically dismantled him. Some people climb the ladder and think they built it themselves. Other people climb it and remember who built it, who maintained it, who fought to keep it standing. Then they make sure the next person can climb too. Jasmine Crockett remembered. That's what made her dangerous. Not anger, not rhetoric, memory. The simple, devastating act of holding someone accountable to their own story. And J.D. Vance, sitting in his transition office 3,000 miles away, finally understood what his grandmother had been trying to teach him all along. The system that saves you is the system you have to protect. He just wished he'd learned that lesson before 42 million people watched him forget it.